Hey squad, it's GooberTroy here, continuing on with my beginner class overview series. In this video series, I will provide a very basic overview of each class and spec, highlighting the core rotation abilities and resources to provide a general understanding of how a spec feels to play. These videos are meant to be an introduction to each class and spec and provide new players with some knowledge to help determine which class might best fit their playstyle. I will be putting out full deep dive videos in the future once the game fully releases, which will serve more as class guides. So if that's something you're interested in, please consider subscribing to the channel so you can be notified when those videos go live. With the introductions out of the way, let's check out the Bard. The Bard, like every class in Swords of Legends, has two specs. One is a ranged DPS and the other is a healing spec. The first spec we'll look at is called Dissonance, and this is the ranged DPS spec, and it feels very similar to a traditional mage build. This spec has some crazy burst damage potential while having a couple flashy abilities, so if that's something you're interested in, you might enjoy this spec. As a bit of a disclaimer, the Bard has two build types that alter your core rotation quite a bit, but in this case, we're only going to be focusing on the Ice build rather than the Fire build. As for the resources the Dissonance spec has, we have Spellforce and Musical Notes. Spellforce functions as traditional mana, and like a lot of your spells just kind of consume it, and it's a primary builder source. Musical Notes act as the Dissonance spec's primary spender resource. Depending on the build type you play, you will generate different notes called Fa or So notes, which have various effects. Fa notes come from the Fire build, whereas So notes come from the Ice build. Moving on to our core rotation abilities, first we'll look at Black River Dragonsong. After a long channel time, this spell will consume some spell force to deal some pretty strong damage. When an enemy is hit, you will generate one musical note. There is a second level to this spell, which I unfortunately cannot showcase due to not having any footage, but this second level of the spell causes Black River Dragonsong to mark a target. After a target has been marked 4 times, a dragon is summoned to attack the target for a giant burst of damage. The next spell we'll cover is called Autumn Water, and this is the Dissonance basic attack spell. This channeled attack deals damage 3 times, and when you fully channel the ability, you would gain a buff called Flowing Music, which reduces the cast time of Black River Dragonsong by 50%. This effect stacks up to 5 times, and when you cast Black River Dragonsong with at least 2 stacks, it will become instant cast. The next ability is pretty simple, and it's called Fire Song. This instant cast spell will grant you a buff which increases your Black River Dragonsong damage by 20%. Lastly, we have Note Melody, and this is the Bard's biggest burst damage spell. When cast, this spell will consume all musical notes to deal a burst of damage. Depending on the note types consumed, either the damage is increased or the AoE is increased along with some passive spell force regeneration. For the demonstration, we will again be looking at the Dissonance spec through an Ice build perspective. To get combat started, we will begin by hard casting a Black River Dragonsong. Immediately afterwards, we will apply our Fire Song to buff any future Dragonsongs. Afterwards, we will begin accumulating flowing music buffs by casting Autumn Water. Once we have a minimum of 2 stacks of flowing music, we will begin to cast an instant Dragonsong. We will repeat this process until we've accumulated 3 So notes. Once we have gotten our notes, we will let loose a Note Melody for big damage. From here, it's just about generating flowing music with Autumn Water and generating notes with Black River Dragonsong. We want to ensure we have a near 100% uptime on our Fire Song buff as well. Overall, it's a pretty simple rotation with some big burst potential. And while this rotation might seem boring, you have to remember that I'm missing one of the biggest features here, which is the summoning of the dragon from Black River Dragonsong. But moving on to the next spec, we have the Harmony, which is the Bard's healing role. The niche and specialization of this spec will be group healing. Therefore, if a raid encounter has high sustained raid-wide damage, consider bringing a Harmony Bard. As a bit of a disclaimer though, I did not get to test the Bard out in any dungeon environments, and therefore some skill demonstrations may be lacking. For the primary resource, the Harmony spec will use mana, which you use to spend on many of your abilities, and it regenerates slowly over time. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's any kind of secondary resource, so if there is, I apologize. Let me know in the comments and we can get that corrected. Thanks. Moving on to the core abilities, the first one we'll look at is Ornamental Orchid. This is a cheap single target heal which reduces the cooldown of Dawn of Spring. And speaking of Dawn of Spring, this is a very strong single target heal with a long cooldown which applies 3 stacks of a buff to the target. A stack is then consumed if the target falls below 75% HP, causing them to receive an additional burst of healing. Next we have Son of Spring, and this is a casted spell that heals a main target and those around it for a decent amount. The next ability we'll look at is called High Mountains, and this is an instant cast, single target damage absorb shield that has 2 cast charges. As for the cooldowns available to the Harmony spec, we have Mountains Protection and Forest Breeze. Mountains Protection is a cooldown that applies a damage absorption shield on all allies around you. Forest Breeze is the other cooldown, which instantly heals your allies for a large amount. Afterwards, a heal over time effect is applied, which heals for a pretty small amount over every 3 seconds for 18 seconds. As I mentioned, I do not have a good video demonstration for the Harmony spec in action. Therefore, I will just try to explain the tools at your disposal and how to use them. For moments of sustained raid-wide damage, you want to be spamming Son of Springs to keep everyone healthy. You can spot heal as necessary with Ornamental Orchid, but for moments of big single target damage spikes, you want to use Dawn of Spring, especially on your tanks, or maybe the people that are standing in fire. Speaking of tanks, if you know there's some major single target damage incoming, you can use High Mountain to help mitigate a lot of that damage your tank might take. And finally, for moments of high raid-wide damage, you want to smooth that damage by either using Mountains Protection or quickly heal it back up with Forest Breeze. Both of these tools will be very powerful in these types of situations. It's just important to note that Mountains Protection is a little bit more proactive, whereas Forest Breeze is more reactive healing. And that concludes the overview of the Bard. Is this class something that interests you guys? I know the Dissonance spec might seem pretty boring, but trust me when I say it feels pretty smooth and rewarding to play. I think the animations for Dissonance look amazing, especially Note Melody, but I understand not everyone is into the visual aspect. As for Harmony, I'm actually not too excited for this spec personally, and I think that's because it's too much of like your traditional healer and therefore feels a little, I don't know, maybe boring? It just feels like the spec doesn't really do anything new or interesting, which is okay, but I don't know, I would look for something a little bit flashier, I guess. We just have a few more days until the release, so hopefully you all have made your decision on which class to play. But I'm GooberTroy, and once again, I want to say thanks for all of your support. And as always, don't forget to squad up and have fun.